Kia ora everyone, and welcome to our May webinar with Luqman and Craig Murdoch from AUT. I'd also just really like to say, make sure that you mute yourselves if you're not talking, just because the background noise can interfere with the recording. We're going to have questions at the end, and you can either ask those verbally or through the chat function at the bottom of your screen if you find that easier. And we're also just going to ask LIANZA President-elect Paula Eskett to give a karakia before we get started.
Kia ora, Julia. Ona hia te pō, whiri marama, tomakia te ao, whātou tangata, tātai ki runga, tātai ki raro, tātai ahuro, humie, huie, tā kie.
Kia ora, Paula. And so yeah, we'll just get Craig and Luqman to introduce themselves and then they can take it away.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina iwi, tēnā koutou katoa. No tāmaki makaura hau, I kaiti ake puka o ke te wānanga o Aranui o tāmaki makaurau. Ko Luqman Hayes, tōku ingoa. Ka nui te mihi kia koutou katoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So to all of the people, all the voices gathered here, greetings to everybody. I come from Auckland in the North Island of New Zealand. I work as a librarian at AUT, Auckland University of Technology. My name's Luqman, and it's my great pleasure to have you all here, and thank you for being here. Greetings to you all. I'm just going to hand over now to Craig to introduce himself, and he's going to begin the first part of the talk. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Good day, everyone. Thank you for coming along to talk with us today. I am Craig, as Luqman said, and I work with him in digital services at AUT. Yeah, he got me into this, so let's have a chat about open access. I want to start off today by pointing out that we are far from experts in what we're going to talk about. I think it's best to describe Luqman and I as enthusiastic amateurs who are willing to get in and have a go at something that we believe in. And we make mistakes, and I'm sure we will today. We're here to learn as much as we are to impart any pearls of wisdom to you. Secondly, I want to start by doing something that I don't do very often, and that's giving just a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today, because we think it's probably going to get a little bit complex, so it'd be good to have an outline. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about where open access has come from and what it is. In particular, what part did the scholarly publishing crisis play in the interest for open access? Then we'll take a look at how well open access is working today, and what open access might mean in the context of libraries. How does open access fit with our mission? Luqman's then going to talk about some of the benefits of open access and also some of the scary stuff about it. He'll talk about Tuwhera, which is our AUT Library Open Access Initiative, and he'll throw a few other things in there. So to begin with, what is this thing called open access? Where does the idea come from? And I don't want to go back into the dark ages of the internet to start off a discussion on open access, but I want to start with where the term was first used, or at least the first attempts to formally define it. So the image that you're looking at now is of the Chain Bridge in Budapest. And it's the first bridge which joined Buda and Pest, the west and east of Hungary. And an icon very much like this picture was part of the logo of the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which was released in 2002. So the BOAI essentially defined open access as free availability via the internet for the work of scientists and scholars, with a primary focus on journal articles. One of its aims was to bridge the scholarly communications gap between the rich and the poor. The BOAI also suggested that self-archiving and open access journals would be the main mechanisms to achieving the goal of free access to the literature. This image is the leafy grounds of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and it was here in 2003 that the Bethesda Statement on Open Access Publishing extended the definition of open access by talking about the right for people to make derivative works, and by explicitly noting that repositories should be the necessary facilitator for self-archiving. And this is Harnack House in Berlin at the Max Planck Society. The Berlin Declaration on Open Access to Knowledge in the Sciences and Humanities, which was released here also in 2003, is notable for three features. First, it mentions cultural heritage, albeit in the context of approval by the scientific community. Second, it widens the definition of what should be made open access from just journal articles to data, primary materials, and multimedia representations. And thirdly, Berlin outlines ways that progress might be made towards an infrastructure to support open access, particularly around software to support repositories and policies to encourage self-archiving. So essentially what was described at Budapest, Bethesda, and Berlin pretty well describes much of open access as we see it today. So basically what it means is free availability via the internet to scholarly works, enabled by repositories and open access journals, with supporting infrastructure and policy. But why did open access need to happen? What was the driver behind it? Basically, it was the scholarly publishing crisis. And what that essentially boils down to is the fact that research tied up behind subscriptions and paywalls is unaffordable, and that creates issues of equity. I just want to illustrate the scholarly publishing crisis with a quote from Gizmodo in 2012, which pretty much sums up the crisis. So the wealthiest university on earth can't afford its academic journal subscriptions. And it's referring to Harvard University in the States, an institution with an endowment of $38 billion US, but they still need to look at cutting serial subscriptions. So what does that look like in numbers and pictures? So the chart that you're looking at shows the escalation of serial expenditures compared to the increase in the consumer's price index. There's a whole lot of versions of this chart available on the web. This one's from the UK Parliament, but they're basically all based on data reported by the Association of Research Libraries in the United States. The trend that it shows is pretty much replicated all over the world. And I guess the point to note is that basically the cost of cereals has increased 4 times what the consumer price index has gone up over the same period. This one is a chart that's derived from some work that was done by Mark Wilson from the University of Auckland. He basically put in a whole lot of official information requests for data on how much New Zealand universities are spending on subscriptions. And he's put all the raw data on his Figshare, and I turned it into this chart. This is Elsevier journal subscription costs for New Zealand universities. And you can see the trend of those costs increasing in the same way that the previous chart showed. And if you just have a look at Otago there in the middle, basically over that 4-year period, there's an 8.5% increase in Otago's costs for Science Direct effectively. The CPI over the same period is about 2.2%. So New Zealand reflecting that increase of 4 times. Alex Holcomb, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Sydney, put together this table, and it shows the profit to revenue percentages of Springer and Elsevier, 2 of the biggest publishers, compared to other well-known companies. And I think that probably anyone who's making that much more than BMW is onto a pretty good wicket, really. For a New Zealand comparison, Air New Zealand had a profit last year of a little bit under 9%. So how does all of that impact on libraries? How does the scholarly publishing crisis affect libraries? Obviously, the starting point is with those increasing subscription costs in a situation of budget cuts. That's a huge problem in itself, just when you look at that data from Mark Wilson, how much more we're being asked to pay compared to, you know, the reality of budget cuts in our institutions. But I think in turn that leads directly to another real problem that I see, which is as we spend more time and effort on budgets and publisher battles, I think we spend less on our core roles as libraries and librarians. I'm going to apologise for putting a Fat Freddy's drop quote up on the screen, but any opportunity as far as I'm concerned. So those lyrics are part of a song called Fish in the Sea. And maybe this section could be labelled the librarian's lament. We're forced to try and deal with and justify an increasingly unjustifiable position around money and where it goes. And as such, we become easier to marginalise as a profession. Another thing we're seeing is services like Google Scholar and Sci-Hub address the scholarly publishing crisis, albeit in very different ways. And as that happens, they decrease the relevance of libraries to those searching for information and remove the opportunity to experience the context that we provide. For researchers and knowledge creators, the publishing crisis impacts at a personal level. The simple inability to access information creates multiple barriers to doing science and being creative. My wife's just finished study at the University of Auckland, a place where she had access to everything essentially, and she's moved into social work in the real world, a place really where she has access to nothing in terms of the scholarly literature. The issue is shared by physiotherapists, journalists, correction workers, so many others, and real people suffer as a result. We need to think a bit more broadly about members of the global south excluded from research that could enable real world benefits at the local level. But of course, the knowledge creation process is so much more than being able to read scholarly research. Where's the contribution of the local voice, the minority voice, the discordant voice, the type of marginalised voices which bring new perspectives to old and new problems? Even the privileged university researcher suffers because of the publishing crisis and associated systems. They find their work commoditised and monetised in a manner over which they have little control. They become slaves to systems of tenure, research impact measurement, grant funding, and corporate publishing. They experience loss of identity, autonomy, and control of their work. As individual researchers lose autonomy and control of their work, so groups also lose their sense of identity. What might that mean for us in Aotearoa in terms of concepts and ways of being which exist at a whanau and iwi level? Concepts such as whakapapa, whanaungatanga, and mātauranga, which are real and vital, are essentially meaningless to the big publishers. They care little for cultural sensitivities around stories, artifacts, peoples, and the like. An item of cultural heritage, as the Berlin Declaration put it, whatever that was intended to mean, is no more than a thing to be monetised. And if the best way to do that is via a means that engenders exclusion and exploitation, then so be it. Publishing crisis impacts on society and communities in a variety of ways. The fact that there are barriers to accessing information means that worse science is being done in general. Publication is delayed, discussion is minimised, verification of results is more difficult. And where science is harder to do and to access, it is also harder to disseminate to the public. A less educated and interested public becomes a society which finds itself in the grip of a truth crisis. Worse science and a less informed public means less effective solutions to societal and global problems. We face huge issues today: climate change, poverty, wealth and health inequality, and these require radical solutions. Radical solutions don't arise when the voice of the global south is excluded, when the public is easily lied to, and when information flow and availability is dominated by a few faceless corporations whose concern is for nothing but the bottom line. There's a lack of motivation and ability to find solutions to global issues, to enable the type of cooperation and creative thinking which these solutions require. So that's a summary of some of the impacts of the scholarly publishing crisis. Budapest, Bethesda, and Berlin were genuine attempts to define a new thing, open access, which would address the broad issues of the crisis. But let's face it, it hasn't worked. it's fair to at least ask the question of whether open access is broken. I think OA is certainly broken in the sense that the scholarly publishing crisis is worse now than it has ever been. Why is that? What I want to note here about Budapest, Bethesda, and Berlin, the foundation documents of open access, is that they're rather mechanical, functional, and bland. They undoubtedly come from a place of genuine concern and a desire to make positive change. But it's also clear that they come from a place which is very much Western, privileged, predominantly male, educated, and middle class. They describe a narrow type of utopia where the haves divest to the have-nots out of an honourable sense of altruism, while leaving open access vulnerable to hijacking by large commercial publishers and other vested interests. It's only recently that people have begun to reflect on what that has meant for the many open access initiatives which have grown out of those early founding statements. Ulrich has recently noticed that open access is increasingly becoming an instrument that creates exclusivity, exclusion, distinction, and prestige. Essentially, what's being said is that far from solving the publishing crisis, open access as a thing or as a principle is simply being exploited by the forces which created that crisis in the first place. If the broad foundation principles of OA are something we value and something we want to protect and extend, then we're going to need to redefine it. What might a better, potentially more successful open access look like? How might we extend our understanding of open access? What's currently missing? Perhaps we need to take a step back, think about something related, but perhaps more imbued with values. If we think of openness itself and about what an ethos of openness looks like, are we able to bring values into the discussion in a constructive way? Open access researcher Stuart Lawson talks about applying an ethics of care to open access, which he defines as taking an ethical stance towards our colleagues as human beings with complex needs. We would do well to consider what it means to express an ethics of care and an understanding of an application of open access. It seems to me that words like generosity, cooperation, community, whanaungatanga, manaakitanga, political awareness, empathy, understanding, conversation, and resistance need to be prominent here. If we're going to be presumptive enough to redefine open access, we need to at least consider whether it has a place in the business of libraries. So as a final scene setter, I want to ask what the mission of libraries is and whether open access has a place in that mission. Personally, I can really get behind David Lanker's statement that the mission of librarians is to improve society by facilitating knowledge creation in their communities. This is something that I return to when I'm thinking about Tuwhera, our open access initiative at AUT. I believe strongly that this type of activity in the open access area, supporting knowledge creation at a community-led and grassroots level, based on strong and lived values, and existing as part of a supportive ecosystem, is as important as any other part of a modern library's mission. I want to hand over to Luqman with a couple of questions. Given some of the things I've talked about over the last few minutes, what is the reality of open access for libraries in Aotearoa? How do the issues that we're facing, that in many ways are imposed on us, impact on the way we are now and might in the future deliver on our mission? Is there a way forward for us that leads to sustainable open access practice for us as individuals, as libraries, and as an industry? Switch over here.
Okay, so I want to begin my part of this talk by mentioning Open Access Week. This is an event which was initiated in the US 11 years ago and held annually throughout the world as a way of promoting open access. Each year, OA Week has a different theme. Open in action, open in order to, open for collaboration, generation open, you get the idea. So this year, the theme is equity. That's a great word, and it's a really useful one for framing the rest of this discussion. So I'm going to attempt to respond to Craig's questions by exploring three sets of ways in which open access seeks to be beneficial. Craig's already talked about the hugely inflated costs of journal subscriptions and the monopolistic way in which major publishers control and profit from what is, generally speaking, publicly funded research. So clearly something which is not equitable. On the face of it, moving to a publications landscape of open access, say by creating university policy which insists that researchers only publish in OA journals, or cancelling subscriptions to non-OA publishers, would naturally lead to cost savings and presumably a more equitable publishing environment. There are increasing numbers of stories of universities cancelling their subscriptions to big name publisher journal packages and institutions working collectively to boycott publishers, especially Elsevier. Just this month, the BIPSAM consortium of 85 higher education and research institutions in Sweden cancelled its current agreement with Elsevier, citing an unsustainable pricing model and one which was not enabling a transition to open access. That's an annual saving of 12 million euros or 20.4 million New Zealand dollars. The Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, or SPARC, keeps a track of these cancellations, and you can see how libraries are clawing back their budgets as a result of some very bold moves. Those of you who know the open access publishing arena will know there are two main types. Green open access refers to the kind of content that is housed in institutional repositories or preprint servers like Archive. Apart from archiving student research, theses and so on, repositories are there to store the research outputs of an institution's academic staff and, where possible, make it open. This usually means in some kind of pre-published or preprint form, or at least a version of the article that a publisher will agree to be in open access. Gold open access means that final published journal content is freely available for sharing, for use and reuse, but at a cost to the author, sometimes to the faculty or funder, through an article processing charge, or APC. There's been a strong movement towards flipping existing journal subscriptions to this model, especially in Europe, where consortia and institutions are working towards goals such as OA 2020, which is all about converting resources currently spent on journal subscriptions into funds which support open access. But the gold model, there are other aspects of the OA landscape, such as hybrid journals, but we won't go into all of that right now. Just to focus on gold for a moment, and that strategy of flipping, it actually does very little to dislodge the control of the publishers who control and own the titles, particularly those with high impact, or the prestige ones as they're known. And therefore, it's able to dictate the cost of publication, which is to be passed on. So that cost can be set as high as sometimes $3,000 per article. So members, for example, of that BIPSAM consortium have pointed out that in cancelling their arrangements with Elsevier, not only were their member organisations spending huge sums on subscription fees, but because Swedish researchers publish around 4,000 articles in Elsevier serials every year, they had also spent 1.3 million euros annually on APCs for open access publishing. So if we continue to be mindful of that word equity when we consider these costs, apart from the moral question of asking why authors or researchers or an institution need to pay to have publicly funded research made public, we need to ask how this benefits researchers without the funds to pay those charges, or therefore whether, while making content more open to readership, how it actually reinforces privilege in academia, including creating an elite class of institution able to cover APC costs and to retain status, with consequent high impact scores and all the better funding that goes with that. As Elena Simokovic has put it, heading to the full open access utopia via this route also means that the entry barrier is shifted from pay to read towards pay to say. The range of APCs, as she notes, are often around 2,000 to 3,000 euros for making a single journal article available for everyone. As she points out, this might then become a new powerful filtering mechanism for deciding whose voices are to be heard in the intellectual exchange. She goes on, unfortunately, and contrary to the BOAI hopes, this would rather reinforce the inequalities between research worlds and promote knowledge dissemination in one direction only, namely from the rich to the poor. So what are the alternatives? We're seeing the emergence of a scholar-led movement within the publications landscape. The FAIR Open Access Alliance
Their approach is to take journal ownership back from the publishers into the hands of researchers whilst relying on them for services of publication and distribution. It is not dependent on payments from authors or institutions, and costs from publishers are required to be low, transparent, and in proportion to the work that's actually carried out. So how this might be achieved sustainably is shown, for example, in the Open Library of Humanities, which is an academic-led OA publisher that circumvents APCs by collecting membership fees directly from research libraries that have currently over 200. Archive, while it being a preprint repository for physics, computer science, and astronomy held at Cornell University, actually demonstrates the ways in which libraries can work to support an infrastructure instead of simply purchasing journals. So these examples point to an alternative future in which the publishing infrastructure can be collectivized and shared publicly across research institutions, perhaps even globally. And that overcomes the reliance on major publishers and opens up the opportunities for contributions from researchers anywhere, crucially including those not affiliated with well-resourced, high-profile institutions in the global north or the English-speaking West. The use of open infrastructure, non-profit and open source, as Peter Suber, Ginny Barber, and many others have argued, is crucial to the sustainability of open research. As Tuwhera, we have joined the Radical Open Access Collective, which operates as a counter to the mainstream approach in favor of building commons-based open access infrastructure through mutual support and shared resources. The OA movement, as we know it, goes back quite a long way. In the 1970s, there were physicists developing ways to share their findings with their community. And as Craig has outlined, various statements and declarations have attempted to develop those ideas of sharing against a systemic backdrop, which has sought to prioritize power, profit, and prestige over a desire to share. Chris Bourg has summarized very eloquently what so many of us who advocate for open access believe, namely that when more people around the globe have free and open access to research and to the scholarly record, we do better science, and the world is a better place. Why? Because knowledge is more visible, open to greater scrutiny, and there are more applications and more ideas. As Richard Poindar has said, in what is emerging as a kind of post-truth or anti-truth era, greater transparency can help mitigate against the distrust of science and encourage a broader debate. Furthermore, it opens up greater opportunities for the researcher, new areas to investigate, new collaborations to build, not to mention the obvious career or professional advantages of being cited more often and more broadly. When access to research is open, discourses are shared and contributed to across a much wider and diverse set of communities. The knowledge landscape, if you like, is less dominated by the voices of the global north or the English-speaking West. When we talk about sharing research or knowledge, this discussion is not limited, of course, to scholarly articles. Open access applies to data sets, code, books, open education resources, lab notes, failed research. The fact that the OA discussion so often focuses on journal articles is because of the stranglehold that the major publishers have, stems back to the development and growth of the print medium. While the long form of research output continues to be hugely significant, its dominance is in part the result of the residue of commodification of that form, but also it's symbolic of the dominance of a Western mode of scholarship. This is, of course, not to disregard this form, but rather to remind us that research can take multiple and equally valid forms. And we need to be mindful of this if research aims to include a truly global set of voices. As Chris Bourg continues, OA open access has real impacts for the planet and for people's lives. Just a quote on the slide there, individuals who have access to knowledge can live more informed and empowered lives, she said. And that there's better places for societies and communities in which more people have access to research will be better and quicker at solving big challenges that we all face. MIT, where Bourg is the library director, keep a record of stories from around the world which highlight in simple ways how sharing research has real and positive impacts in people's lives. But perhaps a better illustration of this point came from Harvard's Digital Access to Scholarship platform, and it just happens to be placed in a New Zealand context. Kia ora, I am Maori, i.e. an Indigenous New Zealander. I'm doing a cultural impact report on behalf of several iwi in the Te Arawa Nation on the impacts arising from the Raina ship disaster off our coast. If I did not have access to this site, our report would be less effective and we would be less informed, as I do not know any other way we would access this information. In summary, having access empowers New Zealand's poorest communities. This is one example of a real-life impact, and we have to be careful not to universalize these cases to make a utopian point about the importance of open access. At the same time, however, there is no doubt that opening up access to research in these ways has real significance. Furthermore, it becomes part of a dialogue, a kōrero, in which we begin to decolonize discourse and knowledge creation from the cultural and academic dominance of the global north. A further illustration of this kind of dialogue is from a case of an HIV prevention program in Malawi, where a treatment change made by doctors actually increased perinatal HIV transmission. The doctors had only read the abstracts of subscription-based articles. The full versions would have cost more than a month's salary. One of the nurses on the program noted, "We need the results of research being conducted in the developed world, but we also have the knowledge to contribute. We can enrich the debate." So a lot of this sounds transformative, hugely advantageous, and obviously beneficial. But while it seems clear that we need to be critical of book publishing, we need to be critical of ourselves as well, and we need to think carefully about the wider systemic context in which all of this is being played out. Open access itself is not equal, and the resources, the campaigns, the voices, and the structure driving it is almost entirely centered around, as April Hascock puts it, the values and ideals of the white North American and Western European neoliberal researcher. We might think we're building a global scholarly commons, she continues, but it is really being built by and for the global North. So when we talk about inclusivity of Indigenous and culturally diverse research gaining profile and visibility, we need to remember that this is into an arena of scrutiny which is hitherto biased in favor of Western scientific paradigms, worldviews and values which do not necessarily complement those of other cultural viewpoints. So misinterpretation can occur, decontextualization can be easily fallen into, and ideas objectified, exploited, or co-opted into a Western discourse. Of further consideration is privacy and safety in this open online environment. As Chris Bourg has noted, these dangers are unevenly distributed in patterns that match existing systems of oppression. So the tools that many of us have for maintaining privacy and safety are unevenly distributed. The world itself is deeply unequal, so we can herald the enormous benefits of an open web of knowledge, but we would be kidding ourselves if we didn't acknowledge that access to that knowledge, no matter how open we make it, is only to a limited number in the world, those with digital access or those with the digital knowledge in some cases. Far from being the democratized panacea, the web is not what Tim Berners-Lee or any of those early developers envisaged from a comfortable white middle-class perspective. It's a place of privilege, and until the global systems and the structures which perpetuate those divisions and inequalities are deconstructed, open access is not a solution. It is merely agitating, hopefully, within that privileged space. The large-scale movement towards gold open access is a prime example of the way in which systemic issues underlying publishing are unresolved. Elsevier, for example, has hundreds of gold open access titles in its portfolio, and it, like other major public players, owns many of the complementary platforms which make up the ecosystem of scholarly communications tools, all interacting in supposed benefit for the researcher, but all ultimately controlled by profit-driven entities. This forms what is described by some as platform capitalism, We can add Google, Facebook, Amazon to that list of big, powerful corporations with control over the discussion, how it sounds, and where it's heard. To raise these issues is not to be despairing, however, and it's not to give up. We have to remember that open access is a continuous and unfinished project, and we need to be alert to the threats to it and critical both of them and ourselves in order to help it grow. So finally, to get to Tuwhera, we set Tuwhera up as an open access journal hosting service in 2016, built on open source software, open journal systems, software which is used around the world for thousands of open access journals. We've added some design elements to our journal sites which were inspired by other OJS users who had shared their code. Our designs are about making the content easy to access. They're responsive for mobile and easy to view, as well as thinking about ways to improve the reach of our content through various tools. In a short time, we've set up now 9 peer-reviewed journal sites. You can't actually see them all on our site. Some of them are not completely live yet, and one is actually just a journal archive. We've added a single open monograph series and hope to add another title there soon. We have a small symposium site for which we will be making the conference abstracts open in July. But perhaps the most interesting section of our site is the research summaries page. And before I talk about why that's interesting, I'd like to say a bit about the values which support Tuwhera. Tuwhera, which means open or to be open or opening up. And we chose this name, a Maori name, in part as a small step towards decolonization, an acknowledgement of tangata whenua, of treaty, and of the underrepresentation of Maoridom and te reo. Also, a lot of the thinking around values and concepts stemmed from that word. I think there's a significance in the fact that the word, like many in the Maori language, has multiple interpretations and contexts. It signifies an opening up of ideas and possibilities. Tuwhera has developed a kind of wairua of its own, or a spirit, and it's enabled us to consider academia, scholarly communication, and ourselves as a library and as a team through arguably less westernized lenses. So this brings us back to those research summaries. Back in Open Access Week 2016, there was a bit of a discussion here between ourselves and some academics about presenting research, ongoing and emerging research in a new kind of format. We asked questions like, what if it spoke to and invited conversation with its audience? People in the community, practitioners, industry. So this thinking manifested in us working with staff from the School of Hospitality and Tourism to create our first research summaries publication, Hospitality Insights. The publication has been set up in consultation with both academic and industry stakeholders here in New Zealand and in Europe. And the first issue came out last October, featuring content which was reviewed by both practitioners and researchers. One reviewer from industry already reported that having read one piece of research, he made changes in his own practice based on its findings. So here we see immediate impact. And the conversation, or kōrero rero, in action. And we can ask, how might this look in other disciplines, in health or agriculture or in urban planning? And what kind of impact might that have? Could it be powerful enough to actually save lives? And we asked ourselves, what if we opened up these services and opportunities to early career researchers, to emerging scholarship in other ways, so that Tuwhera operated as an incubator for new publications, new voices, and new conversations. This is where we began with Pacific Health, an open access peer-reviewed journal, which is soon to publish its first issue, which includes relevant research of and for the Pacific region, voices which have hitherto not been heard. We'll also be launching soon another brand new peer-reviewed journal called Decolonizing Criminal Justice, which again focuses on those unheard voices in research, particularly in this part of the world. This word mātauranga, which has been mentioned already in this talk, is is often defined as being Maori knowledge, but to use Anne Salmon's definition, is actually a more complex and open system of knowing the world, passed on through a layering of stories, wisdom, and narratives expressed through elements such as whakapapa, kōrero, waiasa, and whakatauki. We see this as all part of a consensus-building approach, guiding us away from a Western or Northern perspective as knowledge residing with and owned by the individual, and towards the creation of a commons-based future. April Hathcock talks about the idea of commoning as having its roots in Indigenous and native notions of shared community and value-based livelihood and provision of needs. A commons is meant to be the antithesis, she says, of colonialism, neoliberalism, and capitalism. Tuwhera is already way beyond our expectations. We brought in our repository collections under its umbrella of openness, and we hope to be able to diversify the offer we have by including data, student journals, and other forms of research. In practical terms, we see Tuwhera as perhaps one day forming part of a shared or collective infrastructure for Aotearoa, facilitating and supporting knowledge creation for and by the community. Tuwhera is not the answer, not the only answer, but is one of a number of similar initiatives. Just bear with me a second, I'm actually just going to As Stuart Lawson, who's been mentioned already once in this talk, argues, if openness and access to knowledge are at the heart of library values, and that is not a given, we should be working within our local communities towards a commons-based knowledge ecology that embodies this perspective. So as a public librarian, you can help your community by steering them towards open access. Repositories are a fantastic resource of untapped research. Use your information literacy skills to help find good research, not just the top hits of an algorithmically biased search engine. Use tools such as the Unpaywall plugin or the OA button. Look in the directory of open access journals or preprint servers if you have to. And there are actions that we can be a part of. Look out for initiatives led by the Australasian Open Access Strategy Group, and more locally, Creative Commons Aotearoa, or Tohatoa as it's now known, and think how you can be part of a movement as information workers, as librarians, as researchers, and as members of society. As a profession, as tertiary institutions, we need to agitate for policy and mandates, but we also need to help forge these policies so that they don't further entrench those elites, but are transparent, equitable, and relevant to our communities. As researchers and practitioners, you can share your work and build the knowledge from the roots up rather than from the academy down. Those values of openness and sharing are not exclusive to libraries, as Moody states. To return to their early significant role in scientific dissemination, scientific societies and universities will have to return to their earlier acceptance of knowledge sharing as part of their broader public service, rather than their more recent exploitation of publications as revenue generators. I would end by saying that as a society, as people, we need to ask ourselves what sort of world we want to create. And we need to be brave, radical, and bold. We need our leaders to step up and to face up to the power of global publishing corporations and think seriously about quitting those big name deals or boycotting those that don't support our core values as facilitators in the creation and sharing of knowledge. And that's all from me. So kia ora and thank you for listening. We have a further slide which comes just after this, which is links and resources and references.
Well, thank you very much for the webinar. It was very informative and I'm sure everyone really enjoyed it. So we're going to open up the floor now, I guess, for any comments and questions that people want to give. And just remember, you can ask them through the chat function down the bottom, or just ask verbally. I'll keep an eye on the chat in case anybody asks something and let you know. Good. No questions? Unless...
I'll throw one into the mix, Julia. It's Paula. Luqman and Craig, that was stunning. If people who are new to this area want to be brave, bold and radical, and they're not in a position to make decisions about subscriptions, what would you say for an entry-level bold, radical and brave move? I'm trying to mobilise teachers in sort of K-12. So ideas from you guys or the audience.
I think it's on the first honest answer. And I suppose that we're really lucky here to have.
We can't hear you very well, Craig.
Sorry about that.
It's better.
So I think we're really lucky here to have a university librarian who has allowed us to do some of the things we want to do and made that part of her vision. So I think that part of it is finding someone in those places who can support you to do these things. So that's a position of privilege that I suppose we have, and we're lucky to have. But I think we need to do more to support each other as a profession, as librarians in these areas. What I said near the start about us being distracted by the humdrum, I suppose, the things that have to be done but are taking us away from that whole knowledge creation, that whole community grassroots thing. I think there's value there in rethinking some of that. I don't know what.
Yeah, I think there's a role for leadership to push a number of things in the open access arena, make it much more visible as a thing for the profession. I think on a practical level, it's like some of those resources up on the screen there now. You can direct people where there is really good research openly available. How much people know that they can tap into those resources. I remember working in a public library many years ago when I just thought all we had access to was just a small handful of databases, when actually I knew very little about research repositories, which give people access to fantastic research. Even if it isn't the final version of something, it will probably be as near as damn it. And not only that, repositories are full of fantastic theses and student research. So there are lots of resources that people may not be aware that are out there that they can use. And I think once they begin to realize that they're being prevented from, in a way, or they're being denied all this access, that it will build up some kind of critical mass, you'd hope anyway, that would lead to sort of policy change. I mean, we can wait around forever asking for policy change or mandates or what have you, but it's not going to happen unless there's some real agitation or real sort of indication that people want that kind of research, access to research.
We've had a question come through the chat from Rudy, who's asked, when is the best time to cultivate the culture of open access amongst researchers? Bear in mind, some new researchers, read PhD students, are probably at the mercy of their anti-open access supervisors.
He would ask that question. When? I don't know, anytime. That's where leadership comes from. That's where you need, I mean, this is the thing that we're talking about people, organizations in Europe, institutions and consortia where the leadership in those institutions has made a point of leading the change in those organizations.
just libraries working in isolation, because I don't think you can. You have to have a coordinated approach, and that has to develop into a culture, and the culture then affects the decisions that are made and the messages that go out from the supervisor to the student and so on. We're all caught up in this system, and Craig talked a lot about it at the beginning of the talk, with a system of tenure or evaluation, which is based on metrics and a system which is completely rigged. So it's very hard to break out of that. So I don't blame students or early career researchers for wanting to be published in high impact journals. It's completely understandable. You want to build a career, you want to feed your family, whatever it is. It's a cultural issue and a political issue, and it's going to take some really radical steps. And it's going to take leadership, really. I didn't answer Rudy's question.
It's a tricky question.
Yeah.
We've also had another question come through from Donna, who asked for any tips on how to spread the message amongst librarians.
Your turn.
These are hard questions, Rudy and Donna. Look, I was thinking about what Luqman was just saying then, and essentially, I think what it comes down to is talking about what you believe in, and living what you believe in. There's some of the stuff that we've been talking about is not easy stuff, and it does go against perhaps the way society is structured, perhaps the way our academies and institutions are being run at the moment. But I think there comes a point where you have to look at what you believe in, and I kind of believe that as a profession, as a body of librarians, our values are probably closer to those of openness and some of the things we talked about in the talk than they are to the institutions that we belong to, whether that be universities or councils or whatever, special libraries. So I think maybe sometimes we're a bit worried that it's not a safe space, but maybe people are just looking for a chance to find people who share those values and who can help them understand them. It's difficult.
Yeah,
Oh, we can't hear you, sorry.
Sorry, perhaps there is a mentality sometimes within the library profession that you kind of facilitate or you help users by just pointing them at the resources that you have in front of you. And sometimes open access is a little bit of a harder thing. You've got to look beyond what you've got. You've got to think critically about what you've got, which is what we're trying to say here. And it's only when you start looking beyond those sets of resources and what you've got that you start to question why you have them in the first place and why you don't have all this other stuff, or why you've not been talking about all this other stuff. And so I guess it takes people in some respects out of their usual routines, it takes them out of a place of comfort. But that really should be our job, because that's all about facilitating knowledge creation or knowledge sharing or information management, whatever you want to call it. You're dealing with, we should be the experts at this. Experts is a difficult word to use, but we should be good at this job, where we don't just look at what's in front of us, where we look outside of that and ask, why can't I have all this other stuff too? And why is this costing this much money? We must take a critical approach to our work. Otherwise, we become subsumed by it.
I totally agree, Luqman, and I wonder some of the work that I'm doing in the school library space is the idea that local communities are creating the content that they need for themselves, that the school library is a creation hub. So looking at Rudy's question, if we can get this into thinking of primary and secondary school, that what I make I share and you use and build upon and develop knowledge, then we don't get to the, we feel like the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff often, trying to change adult behaviours. But if we can preload children's thinking and teaching, and there's some opportunities with the new digital technologies curriculum coming out to embed this sort of thinking, then perhaps in 20 years' time there might be a big culture change.
Yeah, I mean, I think the area that you're in is so fruitful for changing the way that society thinks in terms of that whole knowledge creation thing, and not just being, handed over a bunch of information that'll help you pass the tests. And there's so many people working in that area to try and change that. But I think our small contribution can be, to reflect more on that whole knowledge creation role, and then what's done with it.
We've had another comment come through the chat from Richard. He said an idea, looking at the MIT open access stories, perhaps we should set up our own stories. For example, some of the anecdotes you shared today for our own cultural context. I wonder what platform this could be hosted on.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's a really useful comment.
We can't really hear you very well, sorry.
Thanks.
That's better.
That's a great idea, Richard, and reminds me of what was said in the last time we met. So yeah, platforms, anybody?
I have the issue with platforms, and Luqman and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago when we started putting this together, is the idea of those MIT type of places being the big powerhouses behind the development of infrastructure and platforms and other supporting ecosystems. And I do think it's really important that we don't keep on reinventing the wheel. It's quite frustrating to me, the repository environment in New Zealand, how everybody is now pretty much back to doing their own thing. And there's not a lot of cooperation going on. I don't see why we can't share those stories from, all over the country, if you like. I think that's probably what Richard was implying. And I would love to see that happen in some cooperative way.
And Ginny from, is that Queensland, maybe? Somewhere in Australia, who said that they're really keen to collect stories as well. Okay. So we'll just check if anybody else has any last minute questions before we'll ask Paula to end the webinar with another karakia. I think you can go ahead, Paula.
Whakatakate ho ki te whakate ho ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina te uta. Kia mā tara tara ki te tai. E hi aki ana te atakura. Hei tio, hei hoka, hei hu, ti hei moriora. I hope that went through. My internet crashed halfway through.
We got the end of it. Not too bad. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and this will be available on YouTube as well if you want to share it with some colleagues who should learn more.
Thanks, Julia.
And